So, on behalf of Parts and Self, which is the foundation for Self Leadership's multimedia platform publication, I'd like to welcome our guest for the Curiosity conversation today, Dr. Lissa Rankin. As the author of 7 books, the founder of the Whole Health Medicine Institute, and also as a mystic who researches radical remission, trauma-informed medicine, and spiritual healing. Lissa's TEDx talks have been viewed over 5 million times, and she starred in 2 national public television specials, Heal Yourself, Mind Over Medicine, and The Fear Cure. Lissa's interest in the link between loneliness and disease led her to spearhead her latest project, Heal at Last, a non-profit organisation which aims to bring effective trauma healing and spiritual healing methods to anyone ready for the deep dive of healing. Lissa, thank you so much for joining us today, and a very warm welcome to the Curiosity Conversation.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. As I said earlier, it always just my whole system relaxes when I know I'm dealing with IFS people.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you here, and
Thank
it's
you.
great to have some time to chat with you about IFS and your work and the intersection between. And perhaps a really good way to start would be for you to just tell us a little bit about your pathway into being a physician and a therapist in America. In fact, you know what? I'm actually just going to back up and say, I normally say, tell us where you are and what time it is, and I'm going to reciprocate, and then we'll get into the questions.
Oh, okay. I am in Muir Beach, California, West Marin County in the Bay Area, and it's 1:08 p.m. Pacific time right
Yeah,
now.
right. Okay, lovely. And the weather today?
It is about 60 degrees and sunny right now.
Yeah,
I'm going to
right.
go to the beach at low tide right afterwards with my dog.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm I'm in Townsville in North Queensland, Australia. It's the dry tropics, and we're stepping into another summer. So it's sort of 80, 85 overnight and 100 or so during the day. So it's
Nice.
pretty warm here. And it's 6 a.m. So that's great.
Okay. Good morning.
Yeah, g'day. So yeah, tell us a bit about your pathway into being a physician and also a therapist in America.
It's such a long story. I'm reluctant to even answer it. I wrote a whole book called The Anatomy of a Calling of like, how did I end up here?
Mm,
But I'll try to answer it briefly. Uh, I was raised with a physician father and a fundamentalist Christian mother,
mm,
where, scientific materialism on my father's side, like, Christianity on my mother's side. And so anything in the intersection of science and spirituality was suspect for both of them. For my father, it was like quackery and charlatanism. For my mother, it was the work of the devil. So I am the least likely person to like wind up here sort of as a spokesperson for the intersection of science and spirituality. But I was very early. I had a like 7-year-old part called the Squirrel Girl. She got named by the local newspaper. I was the squirrel healer in our neighborhood full of injured baby squirrels that would get sort of delivered to my doorstep in shoe boxes. And I raised dozens of squirrels all the way through college. So it was very clear to me that I had this kind of caregiver part that really cared about the life force. And that, in this culture, maybe if I was in an indigenous culture, I would have been sort of recognized as the shaman. But in this
mm.
culture, that means you either go to medical school or you become a therapist. So I did both, basically. I went to medical school and became an OBGYN and practiced as a very sort of conventional medical doctor in San Diego for 8 years
Very
after
nice.
going to Duke University and Northwestern, sort of very traditional academic education. And I became, a good sort of scientific materialist who had left the church. But I always sort of, Jesus was my favorite. I kind of kept my spirituality, but in a very private way. Uh, However, the actuality of being a medical doctor in the United States means that if you really do have that sort of little innocent, naive, idealistic squirrel girl part that thinks that being a doctor is going to satisfy that impulse, you're going to be sorely disappointed. So by the time I was pregnant with my daughter when I was 35 years old, I was really in the throes of what Harvard burnout researchers are now calling, moral injury.
Mm,
That, burnout is probably not the most appropriate term for it because when you are here to serve the life force and you're required to cooperate with a corrupt system that gives lip service to patient well-being, but is ultimately at the mercy of the financial bottom line, it is a massive integrity breach. And I have this integrity police part that would get activated when I realized that there's so much more needed for our patients that we can't do. I was double booked in 15-minute slots. I had 7.5 minutes with my patients. You can't do healing work in 7.5 minutes. That's just one of many, many things that led me to feel that way. And I couldn't at the time tolerate, I think going back, having done IFS for 8 years now, I think I now understand sort of what was happening in my system at the time, but I couldn't tolerate the cognitive dissonance of being a healer who was harming people. Like, preventable medical error was the #3 cause of death in the US until COVID. Now COVID is the #3 cause of death. So I suspect that's #4. I couldn't reconcile that. Like, that healer and harmer were two sides of the same coin. And I just kind of wanted to get out. And I promptly, so it was not an easy thing to quit my job. I had a newborn baby. My father had just died. My husband at the time was not working. I was the full-time provider. I still owed medical school debt. It was going to cost me $150,000 to quit my job, but I wound up doing it, and just total leap of faith into the unknown, and wound up at Esalen Institute 9 months after leaving, having a profound experience at Esalen that I wrote about in The Anatomy of a Calling. And I won't get into the details, but it made me realize you can quit your calling, but you can quit your job, but you can't quit your calling. And it began a path of studying mind-body medicine, psychoneuroimmunology, cutting-edge trauma therapies, spiritual healing, indigenous healing methods. And I spent 10 years going around the globe working with shamans in Peru and Qigong masters from China and Balinese healers. And I realized ultimately, oh, they're doing trauma healing, but many of them are doing it really badly and unsafely and with poor boundaries. I wonder what would happen if I actually studied licensed trauma therapists who are doing healing work. And that led me to IFS and advanced integrative therapy and somatic experiencing and neuroaffective relational models. So I've been sort of cross-trained in a variety of different healing methods at this point, and have been trying to take that understanding from the purposes of how do we use that to apply it to trauma-informed medicine for the chronically or terminally ill, because my interest has been, spontaneous remission, people who have unusual outcomes from, incurable diseases. And many of them that, part of their story is that they did the deep dive of trauma healing. Not to suggest that healing trauma will reverse every disease, but that's the pathway, that's the rabbit hole I have gone way down. So I've been teaching with Dick Schwartz. We taught at the IFS conference in Denver right before the pandemic, a workshop called IFS as Medical Treatment. And we just did a Zoom weekend workshop about healing the parts that are involved in chronic medical illness. And I've just been asked to come to Esalen and teach about that as well. So that's been, and there's a whole chapter in my latest book, Sacred Medicine, about exactly that, about IFS as a way to support people who are chronically or terminally ill.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much for that background. Just as a bit of context, what was the number of years between finishing your medical studies and becoming an OBGYN and then taking the deep dive that you've just described? Was it 12 months? Excuse me.
Well, I left the hospital in 2006, which is the year my daughter was born. And like I said, I went to Esalen 9 months later, and that began the path. But I would say the first, 8 years ago is when I discovered IFS. So when was that? 2000. Yeah, I'm bad at math. 2004? No, 2014. So prior to that sort of 2006 to 2014, I was full on blended with a spiritual bypassing part.
Right.
And I look back on that time like very fondly, and also with a bit of horror and shame,
Can you tell me about
because
both of those, Lissa? The horror and the shame, and then the fondness as well.
yeah. So I was very traumatized by that point, not only with the developmental trauma of my childhood, which I've since discovered. I've been teaching medical doctors now for over a decade about consciousness and healing, trauma-informed medicine. So almost all of us were developmentally traumatized. Otherwise, we wouldn't tolerate medical education because it's very abusive, or at least it was when I went through it. It's getting somewhat better. Um, so add developmental trauma to the severe trauma of medical education. I mean, I was relentlessly sexually harassed, physically abused, like relentlessly for 12 years,
Mm-hmm.
um, and tolerated that. And then add to that sort of the trauma of being pregnant, having surgery, having my dad die, my dog die, my brother wind up in liver failure in the hospital as a side effect from an antibiotic he was taking for a sinus infection. And then my daughter's father cut 2 fingers off his left hand with a table saw. And my suicidal parts came online at this
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that level of trauma burden at that point, completely untreated. I had gone to see a couple therapists here and there, but they weren't really treating any of my trauma. Um, that led me into sort of the bliss hunting part that was going from one ecstatic dance to the next meditation retreat to the next tantra circle to the next kirtan, trying to I guess Dick says we do like we lull our parts to sleep with some of these practices.
Is
So
this the
it did.
spiritual bypassing that you're
This is the
referring to?
spiritual bypassing, right? And it
Sure.
was also quite ecstatic.
Yeah.
I wasn't feeling my pain. It was working in a way. I was narcotizing those parts with the medication of spiritual bypassing. I
Mm-hmm.
was unmedicated. I was not on any psych meds, but I was definitely medicated from these practices. You can get drunk on alcohol, you can get high on cocaine, you can get drunk on spirituality. And so it was both an ecstatic time. And I look back, like I said, with sort of shame and horror, because I now realize that it's not a benign way of being, that it was a mark of my privilege. And some of the belief systems that I took on and parroted were not anti-racist. And my sister's Black. They were not, they were oppressive. They
Mm-hmm.
were oppressive to marginalized populations, not in an obviously prejudiced way, but in a very sort of deeply built into the system. Like, if you want to oppress marginalized and oppressed people, the most effective way to do it is through religion and spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
because you can trick people and call it God. So I was definitely guilty of that. And some of my early teachings had some flavors of that. And so it was pretty horrifying to me when I read Robert Augustus Master's book, Spiritual Bypassing, and I felt quite shattered. And it was very, very destabilizing to my system. And this was at the same time as I was in Bali, having a lot of ecstatic experiences when Trump was elected.
Mm-hmm.
So I had been exposed to IFS, but I hadn't really gotten fully into it. And so that sort of shattering added to the collective trauma of the 2016 election, led me to sort of, that was more than like it broke through the spiritual bypassing. It no longer worked. And fortunately, I was exposed to the idea of spiritual bypassing and started reading all about it. And then my cousin, Rebecca Ching, who is an IFS therapist,
No,
introduced me to
Rebecca.
IFS
Yeah.
right afterwards. And she was like, Lissa, this is a game changer. You need to learn this and teach this and practice this. And it absolutely changed my life. I'm incredibly grateful to Rebecca and lucky to have her as my cousin. And that intervention really did. It was perfect timing, because I think a lot of people sort of in like the new age world went through the pandemic and watched all these crazy I shouldn't say that. I'm trying to be non-pathologizing in my language, but all of these people blended with delusional and psychotic parts in the new age and joining QAnon and things like that. We had a lot of people off ramping, like a mass exodus from a lot of those belief systems, but we didn't really. I did a class called Spiritual Bypassing Recovery 101 to teach IFS with Dick and some other non-bypassing teachers, to be like, okay, come this way. Let us give you a gentle antidote so you can keep your spirituality, but you can lose the bypassing. And so I was very grateful. It really fundamentally changed my life to have a path that allowed me to continue my spiritual path without all the baggage and without bypassing the trauma. So I started the deepest dive of my trauma therapy right after my mother died, which was 5 years ago. We just celebrated the 5-year anniversary this week.
In 2017, by the sound of it.
2017, yep, the day before Halloween. So we're celebrating the Day of the Dead on tomorrow night in my community. So it's a big threshold place for me to be sort of 5 years in. I've been in weekly therapy with my therapist, and I'm also in IFIO therapy with my partner. So getting double dose, and my daughter's in IFS therapy. So all my close friends are. So it's been a very collective journey of trying to do this work.
That's fascinating. Listen, just as a matter of interest, I've actually interviewed Rebecca in the past for what was our former publication, the Outlook publication, and she was a fabulous interviewee, and I've had a little bit of contact with her subsequently, and I had no idea that you guys were cousins, so that's great. Just in terms of I just want to pick up on something you've mentioned there, which is the spiritual bypass. It sounds very much like what IFSs may call the discovery of a self-like part or a self-like manager. Can you, does that resonate with you? And can you just tell us a little bit if that is the case?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I definitely was pretty blended with a self-like part. And part of the horror and shame around doing some of the work around my system was realizing that that part was actually very narcissistic. It was very inflated and grandiose, and really thought that I was better than those non-spiritual people, that those sort of, those people that aren't doing their work. And so it was pretty, and I had an idea of myself based on that self-like part, and being quite sort of validated in that world as being a pretty good person. And I remember very vividly, like a very grandiose moment where I realized I was in this very abusive relationship, and he was just really blended with firefighters and absolutely not remorseful about it at all. And the story that I told myself was, I deserve a PhD in unconditional love because I can tolerate and stay in equanimity and calm and generosity and compassion for even the most abusive people on the planet. So I must have reached the pinnacle of my development spiritually. And it was literally like, it was the 4th of July. I remember this vividly because it was moments after that I had a shattering insight when I realized, like, oh my God, I'm throwing all of my own parts under the bus in order to do that. And if there's a mountain, I'm only at least halfway up. And the next part of the journey is going to be the U-turn. And I'm going to have to learn to offer that same level of unconditional love to my own parts. And I'm going to have to learn boundaries. And I'm going to have to, I came to sort of chant my mantra of unconditional love, conditional access. And it was a whole journey. I just taught an IFS informed, in the middle of teaching an IFS informed course about boundaries. Like, what does it mean to have IFS informed boundaries? Because I had no idea. I was just letting everybody crash right over my exiles with absolutely no protection in my system, which of course was what my mother did to me. So it was, it was the shadow work around that, the just sort of, coming to reckon with how my system had come to operate in order to tolerate what I had been through was very, very difficult part of the journey, but it was also very liberating because I realized, okay, now I can I don't have any problem like being as an IFS practitioner. It's very easy for me to be very generous with other people's firefighters. It's much harder for me to be generous with my own, much harder for me to be generous with my managers. And it's very easy for me to be sweet with my exiles, but it can still, I was just making a map today. This is my IFS map from my trigger yesterday.
That right? Oh, Lissa, how generous.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I do things like this all the time. And I'm really grateful for the model and to Dick for developing it and to all of the community for making it even better and building upon what Dick has built continuously as a community. We appreciate
yeah, yeah.
the way
And
we try to sort of cult proof this community and try to,
yeah,
hold each other accountable and be honest and generous,
yeah, exactly. And be real and
Yeah.
just I understand that. Um, I guess it'd be really good to try and make a bit of a link between some of your understandings around trauma and medicine and your TED talk. You know, is there
Mhm.
scientific proof that you can heal yourself, which I was just watching earlier on this morning, and the IFS side of things. I'd like to try and bring those two together if that's possible in a way.
Yeah, well, that is a long lecture that I give. So that
Yeah.
doesn't there is a whole chapter just talking about the science in sacred medicine, and I wrote an entire book, Mind Over Medicine, about talking about the science. So that's not I can't answer that question in a short interview.
Mm-hmm.
What I can say is that for the nerds among you, the science proving that trauma causes disease is absolutely airtight.
Mm-hmm.
There is no question that trauma causes disease and is probably the number one cause of disease.
Mm-hmm.
And what we don't have good enough data for me to say with any sort of scientific accuracy is whether treating trauma reverses disease. We
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of anecdotal evidence, which is
Mm-hmm.
not evidence-based medicine. And we have some early studies, including like the IFS article about rheumatoid arthritis, for
Sure.
example.
Yeah.
But we don't have, for example, good data proving that cutting edge trauma therapies cure cancer. I would
Mm-hmm.
love to see that data. It's almost impossible, I think, to get that data because if somebody gets cancer, for example, the number of interventions they are usually using, my partner, Jeffrey Rediger, wrote the book Cured, and he was trying over 19 years. He's been trying to find like, what are the things that people who had spontaneous remissions did? Like, were they proactive? Is there anything we can do to be proactive about that? And the problem with trying to do retrospective data like that is that they did all kinds of things. They changed their diet. They started being vegans. They took 100 supplements. They went to Lourdes. They went to the energy healer. They went and did trauma therapy. They went to the medical doctor. They went to, they moved. They got out of their toxic marriage. They quit their toxic job. They healed their relationships with their children and went to art school. Like,
Yeah. Right.
how do you say which of those things cured their cancer, right? So it's very, very difficult, I think, to try to do this kind of science. And I wrote about this in Sacred Medicine. I think the current evidence-based medicine scientific model is based on some fundamental flawed assumptions. Like, for example, we can separate the method from the person delivering the method, or we can separate the medicine from the person delivering the medicine. We have the whole placebo effect.
Mm-hmm.
I was in my medical practice, I was participating in pharmaceutical trials. I got fired because my placebo effect was too high.
Mm-hmm.
And I was ruining their data to try to prove that the pharmaceutical was better than the placebo. So, for example, if we're trying to prove that IFS benefits cancer patients, how do we even separate the IFS model from the person delivering the IFS? How do we know if that person is in self or
Mm-hmm.
blended with parts? Because if
Mm-hmm.
they're blended with parts, the model is not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And how would a scientist set up a trial to test whether or not the therapist is in self or the doctor is in self or the medicine is being appropriately applied or whatever? So I don't think that the current scientific method works well for trauma healing or spiritual healing work I don't know that it works well for pharmaceuticals either, but
Mm.
that's a big, that's a big problem.
Are you involved in current research, or do you have plans to be involved in current
I'm
research?
not. That is not my. I'm the broadcaster and
Yep.
writer and
Yep.
speaker and teacher, but I am not interested in scientific research, to be
Hmm.
honest.
Hmm.
I hope other people are, because I think that's very exciting and necessary, but I'm more interested in actually delivering the medicine to the people. So
Hmm.
I've been really busy with my nonprofit work with Heal at Last, which, is I've developed, we just got our first 2 big grants because I have a health equity part that is just very aware of how much money I am spending every week just to support my own healing journey and my family's healing journey. And the number, the tens of thousands of dollars that I've spent over the past since 2006 supporting my own healing is an absolute privilege. And it's not fair and it's not equitable. And the people that need these medicines the most cannot afford them. They're not covered by most insurances. And so we're trying to develop a peer-to-peer support group healing model, kind of similar to 12-step, but 12-step, of course, is not really IFS informed, as a way to deliver sort of an integrative trauma healing approach that will include IFS and probably some somatic experiencing, some somatic psychotherapy tools
Hmm.
and some NARM tools and some, energy psychology tools and spiritual healing tools and sort of singing and movement and some of the
Hmm.
other resourcing tools,
Hmm.
free or by donation only. So we're in the process of, I'm responsible for sort of writing the training manual for the therapists and writing the patient manual for the people that are participating. And we're working with Harvard to sort of set up our first pilot there. And we'll probably also be doing a pilot on Zoom, and then we'll be moving into training therapists for that. So we're absolutely going to be coming to the IFS community looking for people who are interested.
Right. So that's the Heal at Last nonprofit
Mhm.
organization where you're training up volunteer therapists who will donate their time and energy.
Well, hopefully we're going to be able to pay them. That's why we're fundraising right now.
Yeah, right.
I don't want them to have to volunteer. They're so maxed out and stretched
Yep.
thin already. Yeah, so
Yeah.
we're working with Chris Rutgers at the Trauma Foundation, which is a fundraising organization, philanthropy, to try to sort of see if we can actually get funding to pay people to do this work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But in a way that the client doesn't have to pay directly. So philanthropic funding rather than client funding.
Yeah. Yep. I understand. Wow, that's a big undertaking, Lissa, and a fantastic undertaking in terms
Well,
of the
this is the
intention.
advantage of having grandiose parts. I feel like, okay, let's try to take on Mission Impossible and get IFS to the world. I don't know if
Yeah.
we can pull it off,
Yeah.
but I keep saying people, some of the most visionary and helpful needle movers in the world are people with grandiose parts who have done their work,
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, you're talking about other people, you're talking about a sort of an IFS community in some ways. It'd be really good to hear about if you in fact do you work on your own? Do you work in a team? If you do work in a team, what does the team look like and consist of, and how do you interact with them, and how does it gel together to sort of galvanize and propel forward the ideas that you're pursuing?
You mean in Heal at Last?
In your work generally, it might be it might be in Heal at Last, or it might be in other ways, but just the work that you're doing that you've been describing for us. Um, do you work with a team of other people? Do you work
I do.
purely on your own?
No, I work with a team of other people, and the team that we're working with, we have very specific criteria for who gets invited into the team. And all of them are interested in getting outside of the model of being the next model builder who changes the therapy slightly so that I can copyright the name and brand it and start my own training program so that I can profit from it.
Mm.
That's the model. And that is not equitable.
Mm.
It's a capitalist model. And so everybody in the team either has kind of done their sort of independent, like they've they've maxed out their ambitious parts, and they've kind of
Mhm.
accomplished everything that their ambitious parts need to feel like they've succeeded. Or they come from, wealth and don't need money.
Mhm.
And they have a humanitarian part and a social justice part that's really aimed at sort of, I don't even really care if anybody knows I'm involved in this. The only reason I'm talking about it is because we haven't started fundraising yet. And sometimes people hear me talk about it in places like that, and they reach out to my executive director, Nikolai, and offer grant money. So I mention myself only because some people have come to trust the work that I'm doing. And so they have been offering us big grants, like $100,000 grants. So all of us are not interested in being the front people. We're just sort of trying behind the scenes to get the medicine to the people by donation only, in a way that is not about inflating myself or taking credit even for all of this. And everybody we meet weekly in our little, and then divide and conquer. And it's very interesting because, again, they're very high functioning individuals on the team. But they have a different orientation than a lot of the people in my world that are really focused on profit and fame and getting credit for their work and virtue signaling. And, like, again, not to judge that, but I've been in that part of the world long enough to see that
Well,
that's a way of operating in
absolutely.
business.
It takes me back to the part of the conversation when you were talking about the spiritual bypass and the self-like
Yeah.
managers, whereas in fact it sounds like you're talking about a community of self-led people who are interested in spreading, the word and the healing in a more equitable way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And
Lissa,
all of us have been traumatized, and all of us are on the path,
indeed.
actively working on those parts, and willing to talk vulnerably about that.
Which is a beautiful segue into what I wanted to ask you next, which is it would be great if you could. I just want to deepen things just for a little minute. Not that I just want to go a little bit further and say, look, can you tell us about a time where IFS was really helpful for you in a vulnerable or difficult moment in your life?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, let's see. I'll tell you about one moment because it involved Dick.
Sure.
It was New Year's Day, and I had been in a partnership, and my partner had left a year before, and we had both gotten in therapy at the same time. And he wasn't willing to get in couples therapy, and he wasn't willing to consider coming back to the relationship. But we did separately go to our weekly therapy, and then we would meet for a walk on the beach once a week, sort of to, like, confess, to disclose to the other person the parts that participated in the disruption of the relationship.
Yep.
And it was incredibly helpful. I'm very, very grateful to him for doing that, because originally he just left and he wouldn't tell me why, and I didn't know what had happened, and I felt really confused. And the fact that he was willing to do this was very, very supportive to my journey. So we were doing that for a year, and I had a part that was still hopeful, that because we were doing all this repair work and sort of unpacking what happened and getting to know each other's parts in this way, and it was very intimate, I had a part that was hopeful that maybe he would consider, after a time, trying to get back together again. And
Hmm.
instead he ended up not partnering. He ended up having a relationship with a casual relationship with another person. And I was still sort of blended with that hopeful, relentlessly hopeful part that had not given up yet, a 7-year-old part that was relentlessly hopeful that one day I would be able to get attention from my father. And then by 9, my 9-year-old eggs had given up on my father and decided that, we shouldn't be going to the gas station looking for eggs. Sometimes there's eggs at the gas station, but we should be going to the grocery store looking for eggs, and kind of gave up on my dad. So I had, that relentlessly hopeful part was really shattered. And I had a very overwhelming flooding of just meltdown.
Hmm.
I was in my dance community and spent 2 hours on New Year's Day in a corner, just paralyzed,
Mhm.
absolutely collapsed, dorsal vagal shut down, couldn't
Mhm.
stop crying, couldn't get myself out of it. And I called Dick on New Year's Day and said, it's a holiday. I'm so sorry. Do you have any time? I'm not okay. And bless his heart, he got on Zoom and did an absolutely beautiful unburdening of the 2-year-old part of me. And I'd never worked with this part. 2-year-old part when, because I was the first child with a very enmeshed mother while my father was in medical training. So she was very lonely and had been torn away from her family, and she was very young. So I was sort of centered and enmeshed with no boundaries. And then my brother came. And so it was this moment where the 2-year-old in me saw my brother breastfeeding with my mother for the first time and was absolutely lost her shit, like jealous, like
Rageful.
terrified,
Sure.
enraged, like, what in the world is this monster doing on my mother's breast? And I was still breastfeeding and had not been weaned and had not been adequately warned and had not been prepared. And so this part was just felt unchosen, unspecial, discarded, disposable. Like the image this part was giving me was like dirty toilet tissue that got soiled and then thrown away. Like that's
Mhm.
how exile this part felt.
Mhm.
And this was getting triggered by this partner going off to somebody else. And it was the sweetest part of this was in the redo when Dick's asking, so what should have happened, right? Do you want to kill the brother? Do you want to like bludgeon the mother? Like, what do you want to do? And this 2-year-old had absolutely no interest in my mother or my brother, and it wanted to breastfeed me. And it
Yeah,
was
right.
just the sweetest little reunion. And it
Yeah.
was an incredibly powerful and permanent unburdening, because I had an experience about a year later with my best friend who had become really my partner substitute. She was partnered with somebody with early Alzheimer's, so he wasn't really a partner, and I was single. And so we spoke every day, we saw each other every weekend. And then during COVID, she got a new boyfriend and moved away.
Mhm.
And this part that might have felt replaced, disposable, discarded, all those feelings, just was really happy for her and sad for me, but was able to sort of not make it about me and be able to be more in self and supportive of her journey, and get to know her new boyfriend and expand the circle of care for all of us. So it was such a beautiful example of what happens when we do those unburdenings and hit potentially similar triggers
Mm.
without it's like cutting the tripwire for the song and dance. It was very beautiful. I was really grateful to Dick for that one.
Yeah. Do you know, Lissa, I just want to acknowledge what a beautiful story it is about your unburdening, but also your generosity in sharing that with us. Thank you. That's a
Mm.
really deep and intimate and beautiful and appropriate story to share. So
Oh,
just want to acknowledge that and honor it. Thank you.
thank you.
Do you know, we're coming close to the end of our time, but I always ask my guests if you could share with us your favorite, one of your favorite quotes or mantras that you live by, and that you just can't go without.
Oh
Might be a
gosh.
quote, it might be a thought, it might be a principle, but a particular
Yeah.
quote or mantra that by which you live that you just can't go without.
I have one by Mark Nepo that I love, and to me it's like the essence of IFS.
Hmm.
It says each person is born with an unencumbered spot, free of expectation and regret, free of ambition and embarrassment, free of fear and worry, an umbilical spot of grace where we were each first touched by God. It is this spot of grace that issues peace. Psychologists call this spot the psyche. Theologians call it the soul. Jung calls it the seat of the unconscious. Hindu masters call it Atman. Buddhists call it Dharma. Rilke calls it inwardness. Sufis call it Qualb. And Jesus calls it the center of our love. To know this spot of inwardness is to know who we are, not by surface markers of identity, not by where we work or what we wear or how we like to be addressed, but by feeling our place in relation to the infinite and by inhabiting it. This is a hard, lifelong task, for the nature of becoming is a constant filming over of where we begin, while the nature of being is a constant erosion of what is not essential. Each of us lives in the midst of this ongoing tension, growing tarnished or covered over, only to be worn back to that incorruptible spot of grace at our core. When the film is worn through, we have moments of enlightenment, moments of wholeness, moments of satori, as the Zen sages term it, moments of clear living when inner meets outer, moments of full integrity of being, moments of complete oneness. And whether the film is a veil of culture, of memory, of mental or religious training, of trauma or sophistication, the removal of that film and the restoration of that timeless spot of grace is the goal of all therapy and education. Regardless of subject matter, this is the only thing worth teaching, how to uncover that original center and how to live there once it is restored. We call the filming over a deadening of heart, and the process of return, whether brought about through suffering or love, is how we unlearn our way back to God.
Mm.
I love that one.
Wow.
To me, that's like self-leadership.
It's
There you go.
self-energy, isn't it? Yeah, that's
Right.
and can you just spell that gentleman's last name for us?
It's
Because I'm
Mark
sure people
Nepo. Yes, Mark Nepo.
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 Fabulous.
Nepo. And it's from Unlearning Back to God, Essays on Inwardness.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
All right, Lissa. I just want to finish by asking, what's it been like for you chatting with us today from your end? It's been fabulous from our end, but how's it been for you?
Oh no, it's lovely. Like I said, I always feel like I feel safe and capable of being really vulnerable and generous when I'm with
Mm-hmm.
IFS people, because I know that they will be as generous with me as I try to be with them. So it creates, I think it's wonderful when we can have sort of circles where the leadership in our community can be as vulnerable as the people that are maybe used to being the students in our communities. And I think it's really important. Again, that's part of how we cult proof our communities, right? Is by not pedestalizing anyone in our communities and not expecting them to be anything other than human with parts.
Well,
you know,
you've been very generous, and it's been an absolute pleasure on behalf of Parts and Self and the Foundation for Self Leadership. Lissa, I do want to thank you for your generosity and your authenticity and your openness and your self energy. And it would be great to have the possibility to catch up with you again at some stage in the future when you're doing other work and also your work develops.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.